I should have been thinking about my first dance, not my termination letter. The morning of my wedding, while the flowers were still being arranged and guests were finding their seats, my phone buzzed. One cold subject line sat on the screen: employment status update. My hands trembled as I opened it, right there in the bridal suite, surrounded by laughter and champagne. In a single paragraph, 18 years of my life were erased. No warning, no conversation. Just a decision signed by a man who had shaken my hand only weeks before, pretending I mattered. The words were so clinical it felt surreal. Effective immediately, all system access revoked. I had built those systems. They were my fingerprint on the company's survival through crisis after crisis. And yet, in that moment, they reduced me to nothing more than an expired password. I remember staring at my dress in the mirror, the lace catching the light, and thinking, how can the happiest day of my life collide with the cruelest betrayal? My heart split in two, half beating for the vows I was about to make, half breaking over the loyalty that had just been discarded. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about being erased, about being told in the most brutal way that my devotion had no value, that my name could be deleted as easily as pressing a key. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask, where are you listening from today? And more importantly, have you ever felt invisible at work? Share your thoughts below. Your story might just remind someone else that they're not as alone as they feel. Loyalty is a strange thing. People praise it in speeches, celebrate it in company slogans, but when you live it, when you breathe it every single day, it almost feels invisible. That was my role for nearly 2 decades at Redline Systems. I wasn't the face in the glossy brochures or the voice quoted in the press. I was the one behind the curtain, stitching the pieces together, making sure the stage lights never went out. I can still remember the nights that bled into mornings. My phone would buzz at 3 a.m., warning of another critical failure. While most executives were asleep, I'd be hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, hair tied back, coffee going cold beside me. My husband would ask softly, "Another one?" And I'd nod, already typing. I told myself it was worth it. I told myself someone, somewhere noticed. And sometimes they did, but not in the way I hoped. A manager would pat my shoulder and say, "You're a safe pair of hands." At first, I took it as a compliment. Later, I realized it was code for, "We can dump anything on you and you won't complain." I skipped vacations. I dialed into meetings from waiting rooms while doctors adjusted IVs for my mother. I even once joined a conference call from a dentist's chair, one hand signaling the hygienist to pause while I answered a question about server stability. Every sacrifice blurred into the next until it all felt normal, until I felt invisible. But invisibility has a cost. When you're always the shadow people, people forget that you're there by choice, that you're carrying weight they couldn't survive for a week. And the more I gave, the more the people above me mistook silence for weakness. They didn't see the frustration building. They didn't hear the questions I was asking myself late at night. How long can loyalty survive if it's never returned? And what happens when the shadow decides to step out of the dark? Every story has a turning point. For me, it came the day Nathan Cole walked through the glass doors of Redline Systems. He was the new CEO brought in by the board with promises of fresh vision and strategic direction. On the surface, he looked polished, custom suit, slick smile, and the kind of confidence that fills a room before he even says a word. But beneath that charm, there was something colder. I noticed it in the way he scanned the office on his first day, not to meet people, but to measure them. His eyes flicked from desk to desk like he was arranging chess pieces in his head. And when he shook my hand, it wasn't a greeting, it was an evaluation. A pause, a raised eyebrow, like he was already deciding how useful I would be, and for how long. At first, his moves were subtle. In meetings, he would interrupt me mid-sentence, only to repeat my point 5 minutes later as if it were his own. Emails I drafted would be sent out under his name. Small victories I had earned quietly disappeared into his portfolio of achievements. I told myself to let it go, to focus on the work, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, after presenting a solution I had spent weeks refining, he leaned back in his leather chair and smiled. "Good thinking, Clara," he said loudly before turning to the group. "This is exactly the kind of innovation I expect from my leadership." The room clapped. My name wasn't even mentioned in the notes that went out afterward. That was Nathan Public Praise with private theft. He didn't need to humiliate you outright. His power was quieter, more insidious. He rewrote reality one detail at a time until the credit you deserved no longer existed, and the silence around you grew heavier each day. I remember sitting at my desk after that meeting, staring at the cursor blinking on my screen, asking myself if he could take my ideas this easily, what else was he willing to take? The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, deliberate, like someone turning down the volume on my presence one notch at a time. At first, it was small things, a meeting invite that somehow never reached my inbox, a brainstorming session scheduled during hours they knew I couldn't attend. I brushed it off as mistakes, but after the third or fourth time, it no longer felt like an accident. Colleagues who once came to me for advice started avoiding my desk. At lunch, conversations would fall silent the moment I walked into the break room, only to pick up again as soon as I left. Projects I had helped design were suddenly reassigned. My role shrank, not on paper, but in practice. It was as if Nathan had quietly rewritten the script and cast me as an extra in a play I had once directed. The hardest part wasn't the work itself, it was the loneliness. Sitting at the far end of a polished conference table, my suggestions ignored while Nathan's inner circle nodded at everything he said. The looks exchanged across the room told me they knew I was being sidelined, but no one wanted to be next. Fear makes silence contagious. I tried confronting him once. After a strategy session, I asked, why wasn't I included in the client call? He smiled without looking up from his phone. "Clara, you're reliable. You'll always have a role." "But leadership is about visibility." His words stung more than I expected. Reliable? Safe hands? The same phrases that once felt like acknowledgement now sounded like a cage. Every day I walked into that office, I felt myself fading, less visible, less valuable, less human. And yet a part of me refused to break. Because somewhere inside, I knew being pushed into the shadows only made it easier for me to watch, to listen, to plan. The question that haunted me wasn't if Nathan would try to erase me completely. It was how far he was willing to go, and how long I could endure before I made my move. The day it happened felt strangely ordinary. The office buzzed with the usual chatter, keyboards clicking, phones ringing. But when my name appeared in a calendar invite labeled "Private Meeting," I knew. No explanation was needed. My stomach tightened, but my face stayed calm. I walked the familiar hallway toward the glass office that had become a stage for so many quiet exits. Nathan was already there, leaning back in his chair, like a king waiting to deliver judgment. Beside him sat the HR director, shuffling papers that looked too neat, too prepared. They didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Clara," Nathan began, his tone dripping with rehearsed sympathy, "the company is moving in a new direction. Your position is no longer aligned with our future goals." I almost laughed at the phrasing. No longer aligned. As if I were a piece of outdated furniture. I stayed silent, letting the words hang in the air while he slid a folder across the table. Inside was everything: termination forms, NDA agreements, the polite suggestion to return my badge and laptop by end of day. HR shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. I could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck, but I forced my expression into neutrality. If this was their execution, they would get no spectacle from me. What struck me wasn't the cruelty, it was the efficiency. They had already reassigned my responsibilities. They had already arranged who would sit at my desk. Even the small plant on the corner of my workspace had been promised to someone else. I had been erased before I had even walked out the door. As I stood to leave, Nathan offered one last smile, thin and sharp. "You'll land on your feet. People like you always do." I walked out without a word, clutching the folder like a death sentence. But deep inside, beneath the ache and the humiliation, something unexpected flickered, an odd, quiet sense of control. Because I knew something he didn't. And while Nathan thought he had written my ending, I had already begun outlining his. Walking out of that building, badge turned in and future erased, I should have felt broken. Instead, I felt oddly steady. Because what Nathan and his board didn't know was that I had kept something alive long before they decided to cut me out. Years earlier, during sleepless nights and quiet weekends, I had built something of my own. Not company property, not a group project. Mine. A system I had coded line by line, refining and reshaping until it became an algorithm powerful enough to predict risks no executive could see coming. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I couldn't stop myself from solving problems, even when no one asked me to. But I wasn't naive. I knew how corporate games worked. So before the company ever touched a fragment of it, I had filed a provisional patent in my own name. It was my safety net, my invisible line in the sand, proof that what I created belonged to me, no matter how many boardrooms Nathan smiled his way through. I never spoke about it at work. I kept the files separate, the records airtight. Every update, every test, every timestamp logged with precision. While they saw me as the dependable shadow quietly fixing their messes, I was quietly protecting the one thing they couldn't erase. My idea. I remember sitting at my kitchen table after the firing, opening the folder where I kept the documents. Page after page, the trail was clear. Commit logs, draft notes, legal confirmations. My fingerprints were everywhere. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. They thought they had stripped me of everything. They had no idea that their empire was already standing on ground I controlled. And as I stared at those papers, one thought crystallized in my mind. Loyalty had ended the moment they betrayed me. From here on, I wasn't going to play the loyal shadow anymore. I was going to play the architect. It didn't take long for me to realize just how deeply Redline had tied itself to the very system I had created. What started as a side project on my own laptop had become the spine of their flagship product. Line by line, update by update, my algorithm had been woven into everything from client dashboards to real-time analytics that executives bragged about in glossy investor reports. I used to watch the board celebrate quarterly numbers, smiling as if they had pulled off a miracle. But I knew the truth. Without that code quietly running in the background, their miracle would have collapsed. They depended on it more than they even understood. The irony was sharp. For years, they treated me like the safe pair of hands, someone replaceable, someone who could be swapped out without consequence. But behind the polished glass walls, their empire leaned entirely on the work they had dismissed. Without it, their systems would fail within days, maybe hours. I remembered an executive once saying during a strategy session, "The beauty of Redline is its resilience." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Resilience? It wasn't resilience. It was me. It was my code. And the higher they built their empire, the more fragile it became, because all of it rested on ground they didn't own. After I left, I kept listening, quietly, through contacts, through whispers, through the small cracks that always appear in a corporate wall. I learned that Nathan's expansion strategy, the deals he was promising, the growth he was pitching, wasn't just ambitious. It was reckless. He was betting everything on the system I had designed, scaling it faster, selling it harder, all without realizing the foundation wasn't theirs to stand on. Every empire looks invincible until the ground shifts beneath it. And Redline had no idea just how loose the sand was beneath their feet. Because while they were busy congratulating themselves, I was already preparing to test just how far that sand could sink. I knew from the moment I walked out of Redline that emotions alone wouldn't win this battle. Anger fades, humiliation softens, but paperwork, that lasts. If Nathan had turned my career into a transaction, then I was going to meet him on the battlefield. He could never charm his way through the law. The first step was calling Victor Martinez, a patent attorney I trusted. Victor was calm, meticulous, the kind of man who could read a 100-page contract like most people read the morning news. When I laid out my files, commit logs, drafts, time-stamped prototypes, he didn't look surprised. He just adjusted his glasses and said, "Clara, this is airtight. If they're using this, they're standing on your property." Hearing those words was like a switch flipping. For years, I had questioned my worth, second-guessed whether my work mattered. And now, sitting in that quiet office with folders stacked between us, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: validation. Victor explained the process carefully. We'd convert the provisional patent into a full one, expanding the claims, locking every loophole shut. We'd establish the chain of ownership down to the minute, proving that every critical piece of code had originated with me. Not Redline, not Nathan, not anyone else. It wasn't glamorous. It was late nights reviewing documents, rewriting technical language into legal armor, answering questions until my head ached. But with every page we filed, I felt the weight of invisibility lifting. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was building something solid, something they couldn't erase with a termination letter. And the best part? They didn't even know it was happening. While Nathan was out pitching investors on his breakthrough system, I was quietly transforming my idea into the very weapon that could stop him cold. By the time Victor handed me the finalized paperwork, stamped and sealed, I realized something that made me almost smile. They thought I had left with nothing. In reality, I had just loaded the first round, and soon I'd be ready to pull the trigger. There's a difference between lashing out and striking with precision. I had no interest in burning everything down just to watch it fall. What I wanted was control, and control comes from timing. Victor had prepared the legal foundation, but a patent alone doesn't topple an empire. To make it matter, I needed leverage, and leverage meant choosing the moment they would least expect me. That's when I reached out to Zenith Analytics, Redline's biggest rival. I didn't call their legal department. I called Ellen, a senior vice president I had met years before at a tech summit. Back then, she admired my work. Now she listened quietly as I explained what I had, what I owned, and what I was willing to offer. Her answer was immediate. "If what you're saying is true, Clara, this could change everything. We'll sign exclusivity." Just like that, the weapon was armed. But firing it required careful choreography. The press release wasn't sent on a random day. It went out on a Tuesday, exactly at 11:45 a.m. The peak of Wall Street's lunch hour, when news spreads like wildfire through trading floors and investor chats. I'll never forget watching the clock tick toward 11:44, heart-pounding cursor hovering over the confirmation button. My phone buzzed with a final message from Ellen, "Ready when you are." At 11:45, I clicked. In that instant, the announcement went live. Zenith had secured exclusive rights to my patented system. Screens lit up, inboxes exploded, and Redline's investors saw in black and white what Nathan had failed to protect. I didn't need to storm their office. I didn't need to raise my voice. One calculated move delivered at the right second was enough to cut through every layer of arrogance they had wrapped themselves in. And as the first headlines began to appear, I knew the strike had landed. But the real impact, the shockwaves it would send through Redline, was still on its way. The first tremor hit within minutes. Traders on Wall Street saw the Zenith press release and reacted like it was a fire alarm. Screens flashed red. Redline's stock dropped 3% in the first 10 minutes, then 5%, then 7%. By the end of the hour, analysts were already publishing reports with one word in bold at the top: liability. Inside Redline, chaos erupted. I didn't need to be there to feel it. I could see it unfolding online. Leaked chat messages popped up in industry forums. "What the hell is going on?" one employee wrote. Another answered, "Nathan swore we had this locked down." The irony was sharp. They thought their fortress was unshakable. Now the cracks were visible to everyone. Reporters swarmed the story. Headlines scrolled across financial news tickers. Zenith secures breakthrough patent. Redline faces legal uncertainty. My name was right there in the fine print. Not erased, not sidelined, but finally visible where it mattered. I imagined the emergency board meeting Nathan was forced to hold. Him pacing the room, voice raised, trying to convince executives this was manageable. But executives don't calm easily when billions of dollars in market cap evaporate before their eyes. And investors? Investors don't forgive leaders who gamble recklessly with stolen ground. For me, it wasn't about revenge at that moment. It was about clarity. Every dip in their stock price was proof that my invisibility had been an illusion. They had depended on me all along, and now the world could see it. But this was only the beginning. A falling stock price stings, yes, but it's survivable. What came next would cut far deeper, because numbers can recover, but trust, once broken, rarely does. And Nathan was about to learn what it feels like when even his allies start to turn on him. For months, Nathan Cole had played the role of the untouchable visionary. He strutted through boardrooms, spoke in confident soundbites, and convinced everyone that Redline's future was unstoppable. But when the foundation cracked, the performance unraveled fast. I heard whispers before the headlines confirmed it. Executives who once echoed his every word were suddenly silent. The same people who clapped in meetings now questioned him behind closed doors. Loyalty in corporate life is fragile. When the numbers dip, so does the applause. In one leaked transcript, a board member asked him directly, "Nathan, did you know about Clara's patent before this deal with Zenith?" His reply, "It must be a misunderstanding. She never had that kind of authority." But denial only works until the paperwork is laid on the table, and my paperwork was ironclad. The board's confidence shattered. Investors demanded answers. Every attempt Nathan made to downplay the crisis only deepened the suspicion that he had gambled recklessly. Soon, rumors spread that he was under formal review, the polite corporate phrase for a leader circling the drain. I imagined him in his office, blinds drawn, the weight of silence pressing in. The same glass walls where he once smiled while erasing my name now reflected only his own isolation. No allies, no applause, just the echo of promises he could no longer deliver. The most poetic detail, that little office plant he once reassigned with such smugness, it sat on his desk, now leaves yellowing, forgotten. A small, ordinary thing, but to me it symbolized exactly what was happening: decay, slow and irreversible. Nathan had always believed he could rewrite reality, that perception mattered more than truth. But reality has a way of catching up, and when it doesn't ask for permission. Still, even as I watched his fall from a distance, I knew my story wasn't finished, because toppling Nathan was only part of it. The deeper lesson, the one worth telling, was still waiting to be shared. In the end, Nathan didn't leave Redline in a blaze of triumph. He left quietly, escorted out after a board vote that stripped him of the title he guarded so fiercely. The same headlines that once celebrated his visionary leadership now carried words like reckless and irresponsible. Investors pulled back, partnerships dissolved, and Redline became a cautionary tale whispered at conferences. As for me, I didn't celebrate with champagne or shout my victory from rooftops. That's not who I am. I moved forward, working with Zenith to develop the system the right way, on my terms. My name was finally on the patents, not buried in footnotes or erased in memos. For the first time in years, I wasn't just a shadow in the background. I was visible. Looking back, I realized the most powerful weapon I had wasn't anger or even the patent itself. It was preparation. Every late night log I kept, every time-stamped draft, every detail I documented, it all added up to a wall of truth no executive could knock down. Preparation turned my silence into strength and my invisibility into leverage. That's the real lesson I carry with me. Sometimes you don't win by shouting the loudest or fighting the fastest. Sometimes you win by being ready when no one expects you to be. Because when betrayal comes, and it often does in places where power matters more than people, the only shield you truly have is the one you've built quietly, piece by piece, long before you need it. I don't regret the years I gave to Redline. They taught me what loyalty costs and what resilience looks like, but I'll never confuse silence with weakness again. And maybe that's a question worth asking you. If you were in my place, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have prepared for the day they tried to erase you?